the oldest military band in the world. 4 centuries ago, the ancestors of these men struck terror in the heart of all Europe as they swept westward to the very gates of Vienna. In 1520, the musty Middle Ages had been swept away and the Renaissance was at its height. No period in history has seen so dazzling an array of monarchs. There was Henry VIII of England, still young, brilliant and cultivated, Francis I of France, dashing and debonair and irresistible. And there was the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V of Habsburg, the secular head of Christendom, overlord of half the continent. To the east, there was Suleiman, a monarch of whom little was known, but whose wealth was far greater and whose dominions were to be immeasurably more extensive than those of all the other 3 together. Suleiman, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. His subjects called him Kanuni, the lawgiver, but the West, dazzled by the splendor of his court, gave him another title, the Magnificent. What did Suleiman look like? It's hard to say because none of his many portraits were drawn from life. A Venetian ambassador reported to his government,
"He is tall but wiry and of a delicate complexion. His neck is a little too long, his face thin. He has a shadow of a moustache and a small beard. He is said to be wise and fond of study."
As to his position, Suleiman himself made this clear enough.
I am God's slave and Sultan of this world. By the grace of God, I am head of Muhammad's community. God's might and Muhammad's miracles are my companions. I am Suleiman. In Baghdad, I am the Shah. In Egypt, the Sultan. And in Byzantine realms, the Caesar.
This was the empire that Suleiman inherited in 1520, when he was just 26. Already, it extended from the Danube to the Nile, from Morocco to the Red Sea. And here, poised between Europe and Asia, was his capital, Istanbul. No great city ever boasted a more magnificent site, commanding not only the Bosphorus, but also that superb natural harbour known from earliest times as the Golden Horn. For over 1,000 years, it had been the capital of the Christian Empire of Byzantium. Suleiman owed it all to his great-grandfather, Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror. On Tuesday, the 29th of May, 1453, after a siege lasting nearly 2 months, Mehmed's armies had smashed through the walls of the city. The next day, the 21-year-old Sultan had ridden in triumph along the deserted streets to the great church of St. Sophia, where he had touched his turban to the ground in thanksgiving. From that moment, the great church had become a mosque. The old Christian mosaics were whitewashed over, walls and even windows were inscribed with the names of Allah and his Prophet. Mehmed was a deeply cultivated man, a statesman as well as a general, an accomplished poet, and a linguist who spoke fluent Greek and Persian, and probably Latin as well. His one overriding concern was for the stability of his empire, and for this, no price was too great.
Any of my illustrious sons or grandsons who rise to the supreme power must have their brothers executed to assure the peace of the empire.
It was a terrible dictum, and one that Suleiman would not forget. Suleiman was born on November the 6th, 1494, in Trebizond, the chief port on the Black Sea. Trebizond is a cloudy city, frequently shrouded in mists and lashed with rain. Rain which, having provided a backdrop to so much of his childhood, was to bedevil Suleiman for the rest of his life. On his accession, the young Sultan immediately installed himself at the center of the imperial power, Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Its site, commanding the mouth of the Golden Horn, had been personally selected by Mehmed the Conqueror, who had built the first of the pavilions and pleasure domes that together make up the palace. At its very heart was the harem, now a vast labyrinth of rooms, courtyards and corridors, in Suleiman's day forbidden to all but his immediate family, to his eunuchs, and to the innumerable women, Turks and Greeks, Armenians and Circassians, slaves drawn from every corner of his empire, whose only occupation in life was to wait upon his pleasure. It was here, when he needed rest and relaxation, that he would come. Suleiman was not only the greatest patron of the arts in all Turkish history, he was also said to be a talented goldsmith, though none of his work, alas, has survived to our own day. And he always encouraged artists and craftsmen, bringing them to the palace, providing them where necessary with studios and equipment, and, of course, personally amassing a dazzling collection of works of art. He was a poet, too.
Each time the lips of my love are hid from me, my pain while my love's away grows to ecstasy. For this lover's heart, so weary, so wan, the only cure is to bide with his pain. With every sigh and the tears that spring from my eyes, their sweet rain feeds your beauty, beauty like a rose in a garden of roses, whose smile forever glows. To whom can I tell the secrets of my love? Whoever hearkens to my heart's frenzy will himself fall greater prey to my love than I.
But, unlike so many of his successors, Suleiman was no voluptuary. On the contrary, he was a tireless worker and a general who led his troops on more than a dozen campaigns. One of the earliest of those campaigns was directed against the island of Rhodes. It was at that time occupied by the Knights of St. John, After the expulsion of the Crusaders from the Holy Land, the knights had found a new home on Rhodes, where they had made themselves a constant thorn in Suleiman's flesh, harassing his ships and interfering with the highly profitable pilgrim trade to Mecca. In June 1522, he set out with a fleet of over 300 ships and an army of 100,000 men. The knights had fortified Rhodes till it was incontestably the best defended island in the world, but they had not reckoned with Suleiman's artillery. Huge cannon capable of firing stone cannonballs nearly 2 feet across. Nor had they reckoned with his sappers, mining deeper and deeper beneath the walls. For 5 months, those walls endured a battering probably unprecedented in all history. But the knights, led by their Grand Master Philippe de l'Isle d'Adam, had the local population to consider as well as themselves. And finally, they saw that they must surrender.
It is with regret that I am compelled to drive this brave old man out of his home.
The Sultan showed no vindictiveness. Now that Rhodes was his, he took no further interest in it. He returned to his capital and to the cares of government. Since his youth, Suleiman's closest friend and favorite had been a young Christian named Ibrahim. As a child, Ibrahim had been captured by pirates and sold as a slave, in which capacity he had finally found his way to the imperial court. Soon after his return from Rhodes, Suleiman appointed Ibrahim his Grand Vizier, the most powerful man in the empire after himself. Ibrahim remained a slave, but slavery in the Ottoman Empire was no disgrace. Indeed, it was often the quickest and most direct way to high honors. There was no aristocracy in the usual sense of the word. All the high officials of court, army and administration were slaves and proud of it, responsible only to their sultan and to their god. Ibrahim, for example, although a slave, was later to marry Suleiman's sister. Another slave and former Christian showed himself to be the one soaring genius in the whole history of Ottoman architecture. His name was Sinan. Suleiman first discovered him working as a military engineer, a superb builder of roads and bridges, of siege engines and fortifications. His aqueducts and dams were to ensure the capital's water supplies for the next 4 centuries. Sinan designed over 300 public buildings in Constantinople before his death at the age of 97. This superb water supply made possible another important Turkish institution, the hammam, or public bath. Here again, Sinan built many magnificent examples, some of which have been in constant use for over 400 years. On campaign, engineers like Sinan were indispensable, and he was almost certainly present on the Sultan's great expedition to Hungary in 1526 against his archenemy Charles V, Emperor of the West, but to Suleiman always merely the King of Spain. The weather, as they advanced westward along the Danube, was atrocious. But the Sultan pressed on until, at the end of August, he finally reached the little village of Mohacs, which lies in the great flat plain of the Danube Valley, about 100 miles south of Budapest. There, he found the army of King Louis II of Hungary, drawn up against him. King Louis's decision to advance into this wide, defenseless plain, rather than awaiting the Sultan behind the walls of Budapest, could be explained only by his youth. He was just 20 years old. The battle began, as usual, with a few preliminary skirmishes, as the Turkish advance parties, distinguished by huge eagle wings on their helmets, engaged with individual Hungarian knights. Then, suddenly, there came a headlong charge of the main force of Hungarian cavalry, led by Louis himself. It penetrated deep into the Turkish lines. For some time, the Sultan himself was in imminent danger. But his crack regiment of Janissaries stood firm, and soon afterwards launched a vigorous counterattack, mowing down the Hungarians in their thousands. And within an hour and a half, the battle was over. King Louis, badly wounded, tried to escape, but was thrown from his horse, which fell on top of him into a swamp and smothered him. When, hours later, his body was discovered, Suleiman allowed himself just a few words of pity.
May Allah be merciful to him and punish those who took advantage of his inexperience. It was not my wish that he should be thus cut down when he had scarcely tasted the sweets of life and royalty.
Even as he was writing those words, his men were piling up the heads of the fallen Hungarian noblemen, over 1,000 of them, into a huge pyramid to mark the site of his triumph. No prisoners were taken. Today, the battle is commemorated by another monument, in its way almost as powerful. No wonder that to this day, a Hungarian will say of any disaster, however great, no matter, more was lost on Mohacs field. The following day, August the 31st, Suleiman wrote in his diary,
"Know that my intention is not directed against you, but against the King of Spain. This has been so since I began with my sword in the Kingdom of Hungary.
God's grace has granted my glorious armies a triumph, such as was never equaled by any illustrious sultan or even by the companions of the Prophet."
A few days later, the army advanced up the Danube to Budapest. Suleiman had promised not to sack it, but when the moment came, he could not control his troops. They poured through the city, burning and pillaging as they went, and sparing only the royal castle of Buda, where the Sultan had taken up his residence. On September the 13th, he and his army crossed the river to the city of Pest opposite, which was, in its turn, destroyed. But now winter was approaching, and the Sultan gave the order to start for home. The 500-odd miles took him 2 long months. But by the end of November, he had returned to his palace and his poetry, his workbench and his women. And to one woman in particular, whom he loved above all the rest. The Turks call her Hürrem, the laughing one, but in the West, she has always been known as Roxolana. Roxolana was, like Ibrahim, a converted Christian slave. Throughout the empire, a whole corps of recruiting officers was constantly on the move from village to village, seeking out promising young children. The boys, after receiving a first-class state education, would be drafted into the military or civil service. The system may seem strange, but it provided a steady supply of superbly trained administrators and statesmen who, having no inherited allegiance to race or creed, became loyal and devoted servants of the Sultan. However rich a slave became, whatever power he might attain, he could leave nothing to his children. All his property reverted to the Sultan on his death. This same system produced the elite corps of Janissaries, the Sultan's bodyguard, and the foremost fighting regiment of the empire. The Janissaries were highly trained professional soldiers. As for the rank and file of the Ottoman armies, they were recruited as they always had been, rounded up in the countryside and pressed into service at their sovereign's pleasure. In Central Europe, the Archduke Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother of the Emperor Charles V, had laid claim to the Hungarian throne. The first months of 1529 were spent recruiting, provisioning, and looking to all the other countless preliminaries necessary before an army could be put into the field. It was not until May that the Sultan was able to set off again. As he advanced along that same well-trodden route, the rain beat down harder than ever. At one moment, his soldiers actually had to take to the treetops to avoid the floods, delaying progress by a full month. Only in mid-September did he arrive, before the walls of Vienna. Now the whole future of Christendom hung in the balance. Vienna was already more than halfway to Paris. If it fell, there was no telling how far the Turkish host might advance. The whole history of Europe, even of the world, might have been changed. Vienna did not fall, but it was a close thing. On October the 12th, the walls were breached by Turkish mines and the besiegers came pouring through. Yet, somehow, it seemed almost by a miracle, they were driven back. At last, Suleiman realized that he was beaten. The days were drawing in, and the army was still dangerously far from home. He gave the order to retreat. It was his first major reverse, a deep humiliation. And he knew it. Suleiman's halt at the gates of Vienna marks the furthest limit of his western conquests. To the east, his territories stretched to the southernmost tip of Arabia and the Persian Gulf. To the south, he controlled virtually the whole North African coast. Naturally, he refused to admit that he had been defeated in Vienna, maintaining simply that once he learnt that his enemy Ferdinand was not in the city, he had lost all interest in taking it.
It is not fitting for him to abandon his provinces and kingdoms to us and take flight. For the provinces of kings are as their very wives. It is an extraordinary and disgraceful thing if these are left by their fugitive husbands as a prey to foreigners.
By the time he reached the capital, he had persuaded everyone, perhaps even himself, that the expedition had been a triumph, and he celebrated it with a magnificent victory procession through the streets of the city and the old Byzantine hippodrome, as far as the gates of his palace. The administrative hub of the empire was the hall of the divan in the second court of Topkapi Palace, a building erected at the beginning of Suleiman's reign and at his express command. Here, 4 times a week, the Council of Ministers would meet under the chairmanship of the Grand Vizier. And behind that small grille, high on the inner wall, would sit the Sultan himself, listening to every word that was spoken. Though he took no personal part in the discussions, he knew that he could veto any decision and, if necessary, eliminate any minister who took too independent a line. They were all his slaves, holding their wealth and power from him alone, and ever liable to lose it again at the slightest flick of his finger. In this hall, too, the Sultan would receive foreign ambassadors from both East and West. Already dazzled by the 12,000 janissaries in the outer court and by the 6,000 cavalry paraded before them with their tall hats and plumes of ostrich feathers, these envoys would finally be brought, trembling, into the presence of Suleiman, as he sat cross-legged on his golden throne and would formally prostrate themselves before him. Not for nothing did his subjects call him the lawgiver. For him, justice was always paramount.
From every virtue, justice flows. Whatever is done by an unjust person is an evil act. Treat the young as your children, the old as your father, and those of your age as your brothers.
No new law was valid or could be promulgated without the Sultan's tura, or formal signature. This same beautiful and elaborate design was used by all the Ottoman sultans, with only minute differences for each one. It's a perfect example of that brilliant calligraphy that has always been a feature of Islamic civilization, and which is still practiced today. Writ little in delicate manuscripts or large on the walls of the mosques, where the names of Allah and his Prophet, and occasionally of the sultans as well, can be found embellished with every variety of decorative arabesque. Was Suleiman fundamentally a religious man? Yes, he was, exceptionally so, even by the standards of his time. But, unlike most of the princes of the West, he was never intolerant. His Christian and Jewish subjects continued to practice their religion in his empire in a way that would never have been permitted to Muslims or Jews in Western Europe. It is said that he once attended a Christian mass, which appeared quietly to amuse him. How he reacted to the mosaics and frescoes of Jesus Christ, the Virgin and saints that covered the walls, images which, as a devout Muslim, he must have found idolatrous, we are not told. But as long as his Christian subjects remained loyal to him, he let them worship in peace. Suleiman's campaigns in Central Europe had taught him that the range of his army was limited. If he were to defeat the Emperor Charles, he would have to do so on the sea as well as on land. His principal problem was the lack of any Turkish seafaring tradition. He had only one first-class naval commander who could measure up to the great Christian admirals of the West. This man was known as Barbarossa. After a long career as an outstandingly successful pirate, he had offered his services to the Sultan. In 1534, when the old sea dog was already about 70, Suleiman appointed him naval commander-in-chief, and Barbarossa had masterminded an ambitious program of naval training and shipbuilding. Barely 6 years later, the new Ottoman fleet scored a crushing victory over the combined navies of the Empire, Venice and Genoa. Suleiman was now the foremost maritime power in the Mediterranean. This was still the age of the oared war galley, propelled by rank after rank of galley slaves. The Turkish slaves, mostly prisoners of war, were well fed if only to keep up their strength. Still, the conditions were cramped and airless, and in battle, the casualty rate was hideously high. Suleiman, for his part, hated the sea. He remained in the capital, where a new problem was beginning to exercise his mind. It concerned his Grand Vizier. Never since the capture of Rhodes had Ibrahim left his side. Inevitably, the man's power and arrogance had made him many enemies, none more dangerous than Roxolana herself, who had grown increasingly jealous and had deliberately turned Suleiman against his old friend. One morning, Ibrahim was found lying in his chamber, the floor and walls of which were spattered with his blood. Only the Sultan himself could have given the order for the execution, but never did he admit it or show the slightest sign of regret. In November 1550, Suleiman the Magnificent celebrated his 56th birthday. He was still a fine figure of a man who kept himself in superb physical condition. Even while on campaign, he would lose no opportunity to go hunting, catching up with the army a few days later when he could. The Sultan was famous for his marksmanship. It was said of him that he never lost an arrow. On occasion, too, he would take part in the jousts and tournaments that his subjects had recently introduced from Egypt. But Suleiman was no longer young, and his mind was now turning to the possibility of some great monument that would ensure his immortality. He summoned Sinan and outlined his ideas. And 7 years later, that monument was complete. Perhaps the most splendid ever erected by one man to his own glory. It was a mosque, but it was not only a mosque. It was a vast religious complex which comprised 4 major religious colleges, a hospital, a hospice, a soup kitchen, a caravanserai, a public bath, and various other charitable and educational dependencies. It is still known, after its founder, as the Suleymaniye, and of all the Ottoman mosques in Istanbul, it is the grandest and the most glorious. As a place of worship, it is also one of the most popular. The Muslim religion insists on prayers 5 times a day. From sunrise to sunset, the Suleymaniye is never empty. With the Suleymaniye, the Sultan had ensured that his memory would live forever. To his wife, Roxolana, on the other hand, the prospect of his death was beginning to cause serious concern. There was no shortage of heirs. Of Suleiman's 8 sons, 4 were still living. But whoever succeeded the Sultan would have all his brothers put to death. The most outstanding of the princes was Mustafa, but he was not the son of Roxolana. So, were he to succeed, all her sons would be killed. Quietly and deliberately, Roxolana plotted against him. One day, when the Sultan was on campaign in the east, he summoned Mustafa to his tent, where the young man was suddenly set upon by 3 mutes and garroted. The charge was treason. But, traitor or not, and there's no reason to suspect his loyalty, Mustafa remained a prince, and he was buried in this princely tomb. Shortly afterwards, this sumptuous mosque was built in memory of the man who masterminded the execution, Suleiman's new Grand Vizier, Rüstem Pasha. He was married to one of the Sultan's daughters, who commissioned the building from Sinan and named it after her husband. Of all the mosques in Istanbul, that of Rüstem Pasha boasts the most glorious collection of decorative tiles. They cover almost every square inch of the walls and even the columns. Like all the finest tiles in the city, they come from the great factory at Iznik, the ancient Nicaea, which in Suleiman's reign attained a peak of excellence, surpassing even the level reached under his great-grandfather Mehmed. In 1558, Roxolana died. Suleiman was heartbroken. He had lost his wife, and now his only 2 remaining sons were at each other's throats, each of them knowing that he faced execution if the other were to accede to the throne. The younger son, Bayezid, could have made an excellent sultan. The elder, Selim, was an idler and a drunkard, known to history as Selim the Sot. Sadly, Suleiman was persuaded to favor Selim. For the second time, he accused one of his own sons of treason. Bayezid fled to the east, whence he wrote to his father,
"Dear father of mine, would you slay your own Bayezid? I am innocent father, before Allah all-seeing. Take me not from my sons, the stars from my eyes. Forgive your son Bayezid, cast him not in death's fault."
Suleiman replied to his son,
So often rebellious, so lawless, my son, in defying my will you bow not to my firman. Since you beg our forgiveness, we grant it. But will you refrain from wrongdoing, O my Bayezid, and take the straight way? Say not that you're guiltless. Say not there's no stain.
For a moment, it seemed as though the Sultan had relented, but he hardened his heart. Bayezid, in his turn, was captured and put to death. By 1565, Suleiman was growing old. Grief for his wife and worry over his sons and the future of his empire had taken their toll. One enemy remained, the Knights of St. John, who had been driven from Rhodes 43 years before and had established their headquarters on the island of Malta. Malta's position between Sicily and the coast of North Africa made it one of the key points in the Mediterranean. With such a base, the knights could virtually block Suleiman's ships from all the waters to the west, falling like pirates on any vessel that attempted to pass. The fleet that Suleiman dispatched to Malta that summer was the largest naval force ever seen in the Mediterranean, carrying as it did the invasion army of some 30,000 men with all their horses, artillery and ammunition, and their food and water. To defend the island, there were a mere 600 knights and rather less than 7,000 soldiers. Their horror can be imagined as they watched the seemingly endless Ottoman host disembark and assemble on the shore. The sappers who wrought such havoc in Rhodes, the legendary corps of Janissaries, whom they now saw for the first time, and finally, the three commanders whom Suleiman had jointly entrusted with the supreme authority. They concentrated their first attack on the isolated fort of St. Elmo. The knights defended it with all their strength. Only 9 were left alive when, after a month's siege, it fell at last. The Turks took the corpses of all those who had been killed, laid them on rafts, and floated them across the harbour to the castle of St. Angelo, where the Grand Master had his headquarters. When he saw them, he ordered the beheading of all the Turkish prisoners and had their heads fired from his cannon back into the Turkish lines. From now on, there would be no quarter given by either side. On July the 15th, the Turks launched an all-out attack across the harbour, but the local Maltese swam out with knives in their teeth to grapple with them and hold their boats. The carnage was appalling. The enemy was driven back, but by now it was only the presence of the 70-year-old Grand Master himself on the walls that gave the knights the courage to continue. Then, on September the 7th, came the great relief, the Gran Soccorso. 10,000 more reinforcements of Christian troops from Sicily, all fully armed, properly provisioned, and ready for action. With their arrival, the Turks, already exhausted by heat, thirst, and disease, knew that their expedition had failed. There was now no hope of taking Malta before the arrival of the winter. For the average Turkish soldier, there can have been few feelings apart from relief that the nightmare summer was over at last. Only the commanders trembled. Hastily, they destroyed their camps and re-embarked their troops for the long journey home. Far more than the enemy, they feared the Sultan's wrath. There must have been still more anger and disillusion in Suleiman's heart when, the following spring, he set off for Hungary again on what was to be his last campaign. He had discovered, as many another conqueror had discovered before him, that conquests took as much time and energy to maintain as they did to acquire in the first place. Hungary was 14 weeks' march from Constantinople. But, though already 72 and half paralyzed with gout, he was determined this time to lead the army himself. He started out on horseback, but after only a few days, he found the strain of the saddle too much for him and had to resort to a carriage. And there were no springs in those days. The journey must have been a torment. Suleiman's first task was to subdue the fortified town of Sigetvar, where one of his officials had recently been put to death. By this time, he was clearly exhausted. Somehow he found the strength to mount his horse, but the effort was too much for him, and a day or two later, he took to his tent. He never knew of his victory. On the night of September the 5th, he died, within sight of the walls of Sigetvar. The army was not told of his death. Instead, it was given out that he was sick in his tent, into which meals were taken as usual. The place of his death is now marked by a Christian church. Inside is this inscription: God is living and eternal. At the time of the siege of Sigetvar, His Highness Sultan Suleiman the Lawgiver went to the house of the Eternal. His noble heart and inner parts were buried here, where at one time his tombstone stood. May God's mercy be with him. As the returning army neared Belgrade, Prince Selim arrived. Only then was the news of his father's death released. The next morning there was a state funeral, and Selim was proclaimed Sultan, after which the army slowly made its way home. Once returned to Istanbul, the embalmed body of Suleiman was laid in the simple mausoleum that Sinan had prepared for it, in the shadow of the great mosque that bore his name. Nearby, a similar building encloses the body of his beloved Roxolana. If Suleiman needs any monument outside the hearts of his people, that monument is surely the capital itself, Istanbul, which he transformed. His great mosques dominating the skyline as majestically as he himself dominated his vast empire. A sublime affirmation, not only of his power, energy, and splendor, but also of his dedication and devotion to the God that made him great.